Thanks very much, Sarah. Oh, and everybody, the meeting's being recorded, and if you are not happy to be recorded, then either turn off your microphone and camera and you won't be seen. So yeah, thanks very much, Sarah. I'd like to acknowledge the country that I'm sitting on right now is the Wulgurukaba and Bindal country, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and all their traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef. So it's my pleasure today to introduce you to Yolanda Waters. Yolanda is a dive instructor turned environmental social scientist, community organiser and ocean advocate. She's currently completing her PhD at the Queensland University of Technology. Her current research explores pathways to engagement with climate-related behaviours within the context of the Great Barrier Reef. She's particularly interested in the effect of social and educational experiences both above and below the water. Yolanda is also the current coordinator for the community-led initiative Divers for Climate. And I believe that Yolanda is our first social science speaker for the ACRS Reef Matters seminar series. So welcome, Yolanda, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Michelle. No pressure. Thanks, Michelle, for the introduction, and thank you, Sarah and the Australian Coral Reef Society for having me on today. I'm pretty excited, and thanks to everyone for joining. I know it's a really wild time at the moment. I hope everyone's safe and well from the flooding. I hope everyone's not too overwhelmed from the IPCC report. Yeah, there's a lot going on, so thank you for joining and listening to me today. So I just want to check my screen's all good. Yes, cool. I'm going to keep going. All right, before I continue, I just want to acknowledge the people of the Yugambeh language region, which are the First Nations owners of the land which I'm coming to you from today, and also the First Nations peoples who have watched over the Great Barrier Reef for hundreds and thousands of years. I pay my respect to their elders past and present. So I thought I would just give a little bit about me because that helps explain how I got to where I am and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I guess like many people who go into coral reef research or ocean work, it started with going underwater and seeing what's under there. So I've been diving since I was 12. I actually used to be terrified of the ocean until my dad said, why don't you try diving? It'll work. And I can't believe it worked. He was right. Don't tell him. But yeah, so I've been in the water for a long time. And I guess that is kind of where all this passion for coral reef research and this, what I'm going to talk to you about today, where it came from. I've been lucky enough the last few years to not be in research and to be traveling and working pre-COVID, mostly in Cairns and the Gold Coast, but also in other countries, and mostly in warm tropical places where there are reefs. My favorite animal is cuttlefish, because I think that's a fun fact about everyone we should know. So research-wise, so I did my undergraduate in genetics with my original intention going into coral genetics and biology, but that didn't happen. I kind of went more towards the social side of environmental problems and reef research. So my last year at ANU down in Canberra, I did my honours project around the time when the reef restoration program was starting, and I looked at the decision-making around that and how that would influence the restoration program going forward. So that kind of started my turning into social science. But then after that, I took a gap year, which turned into way longer than a year. And in this time, like I always mention it because it was in this time traveling and diving and talking to people in the dive community, talking to people who experience coral reefs and love coral reefs, that I developed some of the research questions that I'm answering now in my PhD. So I feel like that time was really important. So now that's what I'm doing. I'm doing a PhD at QUT. I call it marine and environmental social sciences because it kind of covers a lot of different disciplines. I don't really know what to call it. Like Michelle said, I also coordinate a community group called Divers for Climate. That also kind of came out of my time traveling and talking to people. And it's been really good. It's given me a lot of opportunities to talk to people, to kind of bring that social science perspective to different conversations and to bring the community together for all the things that we have in common and that the places that we love. And so, yeah. I don't know if you noticed a name drop on the screen, but I did get to meet Sylvia Earle last year and chat with Emma Camp and Peter Harrison about coral reefs and the future of coral reefs at Ocean Geographic. And those are the kind of opportunities that have popped up just being in this space and talking to people. And it's been really interesting so far. So I haven't been in this space for a very long time. I'm still quite a baby. I'm just about to finish my second year PhD, so I'm by no means any expert. I'm just sharing some things that I think are important and a little bit underrepresented in coral reef conservation and reef science. So that's me. So I thought I would start with an overview of what is reef social science or conservation social science more generally, because I think it's something that people are quite unfamiliar with, or maybe even haven't heard of, or assume it's something that it's not. So the way that I think of social science and conservation social science is that it's this bridge, I suppose, between all that biophysical science, that data and technology, all those answers that we find there. It's kind of getting those, how do we get those into solutions? How do we turn them into actions or policies? Or how do we get that data to make better decisions? And in that gap, you often need someone to, maybe you need someone to fund it. Maybe you need people to agree on something for something to go forward. Maybe you need someone to change their behavior and do something differently. Or maybe you need to get public support. Unfortunately, if it was an ideal world, we would be able to get all that science and technology and hand it over and it would turn into solutions. But unfortunately, people are really complex and it doesn't quite happen that way. So this is where the social sciences come in. So these groups down here, this is just an example of who might be trying to make these decisions and make these actions happen. This is the groups that we study. We kind of look at decisions and behaviors of these groups themselves, what happens within them, what happens between them, and what happens between them and the natural environment. So this is just, I grabbed the definition of Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says social science is devoted to the study of societies and the relationships among individuals within those societies. This is pretty much the same definition if I'm talking about conservation social science, but I would add that it also studies the relationships between societies and natural environments. So in this case, coral reefs. It's kind of understanding that human dimension to these complex social ecological systems to help us improve conservation action. So while people might study fish and corals and seagrass, we study people and we study how people can help improve conservation of coral reefs. It's really important for a number of reasons. We can improve mitigation adaptation to environmental threats, but also increase resilience, and not just ecological resilience, but community resilience as well, which is equally important. A lot of people also kind of judge social science a little bit in that it might not be as scientifically rigorous as like the biophysical sciences, but we still collect data, we still develop and test hypotheses, we follow theories, and we have very rigorous scientific methods. They just might look very different to what a lot of people are used to. Some of them are even very similar, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So reef social science is not really a single discipline. There's a lot of different disciplines which can come under it. And this is just an example of what I could think of at the time. So those top two, psychology and behavior and communication, that's where I sit. So I look at human behavior and how we can communicate in a way that changes behavior. That's my space, but that is a tiny little drop in what is reef social science. And if you look at the diagram there, so this is just from Gabrumpa, the human dimensions of the reef. This just kind of gives you an example of all the little areas you could possibly look into and that are related to reef social science. So as you can see there are so many different aspects, so many different perspectives and disciplines that could go into that. It's a very, very diverse space, and might sound like a lot to wrap your head around, but once you get into it, you can see how they're all connected and how they all work together. So if you are interested in seeing kind of the breadth of what reef social science looks like, because after this, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work, which is it's quite niche compared to what there is out there. So last year, so Michelle and Cindy, they run the social science community for the Great Barrier Reef. And last year they held their first symposium, which was really fun. It's really strange to be in a room full of just social science for the reef, because usually it's just one of us in a room full of biophysical scientists. So it's really, really nice. And you can actually access all of those presentations online. So it's just on the Gabrumpa website. If you Google this, you should be able to find it. And that way, if you're interested, you can really get an idea of all the work that's been done in this reef social science space. You'll definitely find something that interests you because they're all very different presentations. The thing that I have written down on the bottom there is just the key themes of the presentation that were spoken about at the presentation, and just in general what I picked up from a lot of them. And you can kind of tell with those 3 dot points that we definitely study people. A lot of them are quite, if you're working with people, building empathy, trust, and communicating effectively, they're likely to be at the core of everything that we do. And I think that really comes through in a lot of the work that was presented last year. So I highly recommend, if you have some time, or if you're stuck inside and it's raining, to have a look through some of those presentations. So that was kind of a overview of what reef social science is and could be. And I'm kind of going to go in now into what I do specifically and how that fits in and how that answers some of the questions that social science tends to try and answer. So I sit in that space of behavioral science, psychology, and communication, specifically climate communication, which is very tricky in itself. And my research question is one that I think a lot of people watching will go like, duh, of course. My research question is, does the reef inspire action on climate change? And for many people who've seen and been to the reef and work on the reef, you might think, well, that sounds obvious. That sounds straightforward. Of course it does. But we're actually not sure that it does, and we're not sure how it does. For example, I don't know if you can see the bar graph in that picture behind me. Probably should have just put the graph in. But those top 3, the green bars there, they show the percentage of Australians that are concerned about climate change on the reef. So I should say, when I say the reef, I'm looking at the Great Barrier Reef. I always forget there are other reefs, but I look at the Great Barrier Reef specifically because of its iconic nature. So the first one, Australians are concerned about the impacts of climate change on the reef. Australians believe that they are responsible for the health of the reef. And Australians recognise climate change to be one of the biggest threats to the reef. That's more than 3/4 of Australians that agree with those statements, which is good. That's what we want. You can really tell that there's quite a bit of awareness and concern out there. Great start. But those little blue bars down the bottom, they show the percentage of Australians that connect individual action on climate change with protecting the reef. So you can see it's not very much. Now, I want to kind of stop here and explain what I mean when I say individual action for the reef, because a lot of people go, well, it's not the individual. We need to, put pressure on governments and big businesses, which 100%, they're definitely not pulling their weight. But there's a lot to be said for collective action. And so while I do add personal emissions as part of my research, what I'm really looking at is whether we can inspire kind of social and political actions in individuals. So whether that's seeking and sharing information about climate change in the reef, whether that's engaging with local politicians, whether that's actively supporting renewable energy, signing petitions, really getting out there and being loud in that, what we call a public sphere. So I tend to focus on those behaviors. And what I'm trying to do is to see if we can use the reef to get people to take on those behaviors to protect the reef ultimately. So what we call this gap between that awareness and concern and action is the attitude action gap. And so it is exactly what it sounds like. So at the moment, we're lucky. We're at this stage where we've got the knowledge, we've got the concern, but we've got this gap between that and people actually taking action. So it's not saying that knowledge and knowing and caring is not enough. It's definitely an important precursor to action, and we definitely need it there. But unfortunately, knowing and caring, it needs to go that one step further to be put into physical action that will actually protect coral reefs like the Great Barrier Reef. And so what I look at is, well, how can we close this gap? How can we inspire people to jump from this just being aware and concerned about what's happening to actually actively engaging with climate change so that we can protect the reef? Because unfortunately, as we've just seen, it's really running out of time, and we need as many people on deck as possible. So my research is broken into 2 parts. Part 1 is looking at effective messaging strategies. How can we talk about the reef and climate change in a way that makes people take action, that doesn't scare them off, that doesn't make them feel helpless, that makes them go out there and want to do something. And the second part, which I'll talk about after, is looking at experiences of the reef. So what elements of a reef experience can lead to people taking action? So what we do to figure out what messages work, we run experiments. Very much like you would run any experiments, we have different conditions. and we have a control, and we control for a number of variables. So how we do this is, well, this one particularly for a number of reasons, so that we can get a large sample size, and because of COVID and everything, it's an online survey. And what we do is we randomly allocate different conditions to different people. Essentially, you click on the survey, and whatever you get shown, your questions will align with that message, essentially. So we did 2 studies, each with about 700 people in, and nationally representative samples. And we showed them lots of different messages. Some were about climate change and the reef. Some were just about the reef. Some were just about climate change. And we kind of added different subtle message changes within there to see, well, which messages lead to action, which ones don't, and which ones might have a negative effect. What we did was we measured changes in behavior. Now, measuring behavior online is a really tricky thing to do, because ultimately you can only ask people what they might do. So we measure behavioral intention. So how likely are you to talk to family about climate change in the reef, for example? We try our best to measure actual behavior, because obviously people don't always do what they say they're going to do. So we do have some sneaky tricks within online surveys that can measure what you're actually doing. So maybe it's a link within the survey. We know if you clicked it. For this one, we had a petition. So we measured if people went to go sign it as a measure of behavior. Of course, there are still limitations, but it's still a good indicator of how well the messages are working. And of course, we also measure different demographics, different factors, so that we could control for them and make sure that any changes in behavior were because of the messages, not because of anything else. So what we've found so far I've run 2 surveys, and there's 2 more coming. So far, we've found something that I think everyone already feels in their hearts. Everyone that's worked on the reef, campaign for the reef, you probably know this, but the reef inspires action. So we found that messages about the Great Barrier Reef were significantly more effective in getting people to say they would engage with climate action than just really generic climate statements. So really generic, global warming's happening, we need to reduce emissions, the usual. But when you add the reef and you talk about and highlight the iconic nature of the reef and what it means socially and culturally and ecologically, it tends to get a much better response. And really interestingly, the reason why this happened, we found, was because it was triggering feelings of grief, of sadness, of worry and anxiety within the respondents who received messages about the reef, which, while it might sound like depressing news, it's actually quite good, because before this, there's been a little bit of concern about whether feelings of loss associated with the reef, which I think a lot of people feel, whether it would lead to action or whether it would make people feel just hopeless and kind of go down that pit of despair, like it's too late. But this kind of suggests that, well, maybe those feelings of grief are good motivators. Some other things we found that work so far, we found that emphasizing what we call collective efficacy tends to work better than focusing on the individual. So saying we can all do it, together we can protect the reef, tends to work a lot better than saying you can do it. This is especially true when it comes to motivating those more impactful actions. Again, we also found that when you give a call to action, for us, the calls to action that worked the best were those that were motivationally worded, like support renewables, compared to those that were telling people to do things like reduce your energy use, for example. This graph on the side is just a little example. It's just a descriptive chart. So on the y-axis, I probably should have put something that makes a bit more sense. Public sphere intentions means whether people said they were likely to do social and political actions. So talk to others, donate, sign petitions, those kind of actions. And the mean Z score for that is the 0 line in the middle. The conditions that I've got there, we compared personal or collective efficacy, so whether we focused on you or we. And we also changed the call to action, whether it was a private sphere behavior, which is a fancy way of saying lifestyle behaviors, like telling people to reduce energy use, travel less, etc. And public sphere, which is those kind of social and political behaviors. And you can see there in the graph that, well, you can see the control did its thing. It didn't really work. It didn't make people likely to click anything. But the one that was the best was the collective efficacy and public sphere message. And that was statistically significant. So for us, the most effective message so far has been to emphasize the collective and really focus on those broader calls to action. So less on the individual and more on what we can do as a society, as a people. And so, yeah, those are some of the findings that I found so far into what messages lead to action. And currently, we still have 2 more of these messaging surveys, with the ultimate end goal would be to have a guide into how we can effectively talk about climate change on the reef that leads to action, that inspires people to take action on climate change, which so far there hasn't been any evidence to suggest how it's done. So that's part 1. Part 2, so we've looked at messaging. I also want to look at reef experiences, because how could it not inspire action? I mean, I know a lot of people I speak to, I know a lot of divers and everyone who's been out there. It's definitely something you've never experienced before. It's definitely something that triggers something in people. And that's not just an opinion, there's actually evidence to support that would be true. So the kinds of experiences that I'm looking at is tourism experiences. So pre-COVID, tourism on the Great Barrier Reef gets over 2 million visitors a year. That's a lot of people you could potentially influence. In addition, research in marine tourism shows that dive staff and the tourism industry staff on boats can influence visitor behavior. And it makes sense. You know, these people are showing visitors who maybe have never seen something like the reef before. They're taking them through this experience. So they have a lot of sway when it comes to influencing that experience. Next, research in climate engagement also shows that nature experiences can lead to action. Specifically, it can increase a lot of awareness and concern, but is increasing research to suggest that it could lead to action. However, a lot of research in nature experiences is on land. So there's not a lot of research to say at the moment how research experiences underwater could influence climate action. So kind of given all this, tourism operators on the reef are in this very unique position to promote widespread action on climate change. The good news is that many tourism operators are already open to promoting conservation action for the reef if they don't already do it. For example, you know, you've got your master reef guides. A lot of tourism operators work with core restoration projects, and all of them will promote basic behaviors on the reef, like don't stand on it. You'll get death stared for the whole day if you do that. So most boats, it's within their interest to promote protection of the reef. However, climate change is a whole different story, right? Promoting climate action, there are some genuine concerns about it because it's such a political topic, because there's a lot of misinformation out there, and people are generally not confident in talking about it in a way that won't kind of stir up conflict or ruin people's days. And which is a genuine concern. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the tourism industry has to maintain the tourism industry. They don't want to freak everyone out by talking about climate change all the time. I just want to know that there are other reef experiences that we're considering looking at, like whether being involved in reef restoration can influence people's engagement with climate change. But at the moment, we're just looking at those tourism experiences, specifically just day trips out to the reef, the one that most people go on. So this project at the moment, I'm currently getting all the paperwork done to actually go and collect the data. So we don't have results yet. So I thought I'd just present a bit about the planning behind it and the kinds of research questions that I'm looking to answer. So it's broken into 2 parts again. So first I want to know, how do reef experiences motivate action? And I mean just a regular experience on the reef. I'm not going to interfere with anything. I'm not going to change any conditions. What I want to know is whether nature experiences on the reef can lead to action. Right? Like I said before, there's really little research on how underwater experiences influence people's attitudes and behavior. However, there is a lot of research saying how connected people are with the Great Barrier Reef. You know, a lot of people in Australia feel it's part of their identity, even if they've never really been to it. And so a lot of this kind of social connections with the reef, this kind of research really suggests that there might be something there that gets people in a way that another experience might not. So what I want to look at is, well, to what extent do these experiences influence engagement with climate change? I'm including awareness and concern in this because just in case behavior doesn't happen, it would still be really good to know how they influence other precursors to action. And I want to also know, well, what elements of these experiences lead to action? You know, maybe it's the presence of marine life on the day. Maybe it's how many turtles they saw, and that was what influenced people. Or maybe it's, you know, how many staff they spoke to on the day. Maybe it was a really interactive day, the staff are really helpful, and that's what engaged them with, you know, looking into what else is happening on the reef. Or maybe it was really rough and they're really seasick and they didn't care and they're never going to the reef again. Like I want to know what elements of an experience out in the reef are likely to lead to action. So some of the positive outcomes of this research might be, besides identifying those elements, it'd be a good evaluation of what's currently happening out in those boats. So a lot of boats already have, marine biology presentations. They give out certain information. Maybe it's not, climate focused, but maybe it's enough. So it'd be good to have a look at what's already happening out there and whether it's effective. And also it's a good opportunity to improve the quality of tourism experiences if possible. So this is step one. Step two is a skeptical side. It's that, well, maybe, what if that's not enough? There's research that says that experiences alone, while they might increase that awareness and concern, people need a little bit of extra prompting for them to engage in behaviors, particularly if you want them to engage in behaviors after the experience has finished. So people go to the reef, they have their day, and they go home and they do something. Maybe we need something more to prompt that. But the next part I want to look at is, well, can we add climate-specific information on boats in a way that A, is effective and leads to action, and B, doesn't negatively influence visit experiences? You don't want to make anyone angry out there. You want it to be effective, useful information. So these are my next two questions that I'm looking at is, well, does this whole effect of reef experiences on climate engagement, does it depend on climate-specific information? And if it does, well, what information is most effective? What works out there? It might be that we don't need it and that it doesn't work and just the reef experience is enough. But I suspect that we might need a little bit more. And then, so that's my fourth research question there. Well, are there any negative effects associated with having this information out there on boats? Maybe it's not the right time and place. People are on holidays, people are relaxing. Maybe they don't want to get into, how we have to reduce emissions for the reef. Overall, doing this study, I hope to, just like with the messaging study before, kind of develop guidelines for how we can talk about climate change in that reef tourism context. So this is, I think, something people don't think about social scientists doing, but we still get to do field work, which is like why everyone chose to work on a coral reef, I'm pretty sure. So you still can go out in the field doing social sciences, and that is what I'm doing for this experience study. So I'm currently planning to go out on tourism vessels on the reef. What it will involve is me doing 5-minute surveys with visitors after they've been out for a swim or after they've just been out on the reef, whether it's on the boat, swimming, snorkeling, diving, whatever it is they've done, and having a chat with them. They can either do the survey by themselves or I can do it in conversation with them. That way I can also collect some qualitative data, dive deep into a little bit, or why don't you think this message was appropriate here? And that can kind of, while that's data in itself, it also will help provide some insight and depth behind the quantitative data that I'll be collecting by surveys. So yeah, it'll be doing that. It'll be jumping in the water because I'll have to know what the reef conditions are like that day, what the water conditions are like, because that might be an influencing factor in how people experience the reef. And yeah, so that's pretty exciting. Some other examples of field research you could do for social science, surveys and interviews. Surveys and interviews can be done online and by Zoom, but sometimes, for example, for me in this study, the environment in which that interview is conducted in is really important. So sometimes you have to be out there for the data to have that full impact. Participant observation is one of my favorite ones. It means pretty much what it sounds like it means. It means like scientific people watching. Essentially, you record notes and observations that help really provide insight into the data you're already collecting. There's action research methods, which is like developing projects with collaborators and kind of developing research at the same time as developing usable outputs, which I haven't had a go at yet, but that'd be really interesting. It's really applied research. And then focus groups. So those are just some examples of what you could do out in the field with social science. So it's basically the way I think of it as, we go out there, maybe biophysical scientists go out there and you look at corals and fish and seagrass, and we go out to the same place, but we watch people and how people interact with corals and fish and seagrass, essentially. And yeah, so I wanted to finish with talking about how you can integrate social science into reef conservation. Social science is still seriously underrepresented in conservation spaces. That's conservation in general. Like, it's still often you've got only a few social scientists in the room. It's growing, but it's still not enough. I think it's very underappreciated as well. It's even less in the marine space. even though there are lots of marine and reef social scientists out there, as you'll see if you have a look at some of the other presentations, it's still very not well understood. And a lot of people have a lot of assumptions about what this conservation social science is. You know, they may not take our methodology seriously, our theories. A lot of people think it's okay just to whack a survey on the end. Surveys actually, there's a lot of work that goes behind a survey, and a lot of them are guided by these behavioral theories. So it's not just, you know, maybe what you see is a 5-minute survey, but what's behind it is actually a lot of science. So I guess if you want to integrate these social science perspectives into your work, and I asked for advice from the Reef Social Science group into what advice would you give someone who wanted to integrate this stuff. And number one is, we'll get a social scientist. You know, just like you might ask an engineer for engineering advice, you might get a chemist for chemistry. For social science, you get social scientists. And a really important point someone made that was to include social scientists or the social science perspective from the conceptual phase of research. So very early on, it's not a last minute, oh, can you have a look? I mean, that's good too, but it really has the most meaning when it's from the start. It's just like if you're including anyone's perspective, if you're including Indigenous perspectives, you want to be working with them from the get-go, not just as a last minute, a last thought. Number two, never assume that people are simple. They're very complex. Getting people to agree on things is complex. Getting people to make certain decisions. You're working with very diverse groups of people. You know, everyone's unique. Everyone's got their own opinions. While we might work for bigger groups, institutions, and organizations, in the end of the day, we're all individuals who need to work together. So just from having that in mind is really important. And I guess off the back of that is we're all human. So approach everything with respect and trust and empathy, because you're going to be working with other people. And yeah, I know that sounds like common sense, but it needs to be repeated anyway. If you're interested in learning more about what reef or marine social sciences are, these are some really good communities and groups you can go to and join. So the first one's the Social Science Community for Reef. So that's Michelle and Cindy there. On that website, you can see all those presentations, like I said before. You can just really have a look at what's going on in the reef space specifically. The Marine Social Science Network is an international network. They have a regular newsletter that comes out, really helpful. It's got jobs on it. It's got conferences, recent published papers, kind of just news, what's happening in the marine social science world. Really interesting. Currently, there was an Australian division, but currently the leader has now moved out of Australia. So we're trying to find someone to take over, but still a worthwhile place to sign up to. If you're interested in conservation social science in general, so not marine, and a lot of this work is very terrestrial, the Conservation Biology Social Science Working Group, very active on Twitter, highly recommend joining them as well if you want to know more. And yeah, that is me for today. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks to my supervisors, Angela Dean and Kerry Wilson, for listening to me with all my 20 million ideas all the time. And yeah, I'll be happy to have a chat or answer any questions.
Thanks very much for that, Yolanda. That was a fantastic presentation, and I think I was reflecting this morning how I don't think we would have had you're not only the first social scientist presentation that we've had in our seminar series, but I think overwhelmingly, having been a society that's existed for the last 100 years, our focus really only in the last couple of years is swung around to social sciences as well. So it's great to have this conversation coming to the table. Michelle, did you want to run the questions, given that you're a bit more familiar with the subject content than me?
Sure, I can do that. Thanks so much, Yolanda. I can see a few comments coming in saying thank you and they enjoyed your talk. There is a question here that says, you talk from Anna Adam. You talk mainly about estimating what methods are most effective to trigger people to take action, but are you also investigating what action they are willing to take? So Anna, if you're online, you feel free to speak up there if you had more to add to that question.
Yeah, well, I can start answering. So in measuring what is effective in triggering people to take action, we also do figure out, well, what action are they willing to take and in what circumstances? So what actions people are willing to take tends to change depending on what they're exposed to. So for example, like the messaging study that I showed before, people that were only showed messages that were very focused on the individual, they were very much not willing to do things like donate to climate organizations, for example, are very much not willing to talk about, email their politicians. Whereas when we worded messages differently, they were more willing to do those behaviors. In general, there is a preference for those individual lifestyle behaviors, because I think there's a very low sense of political efficacy out there. People think like, I can't do that. You know, what a government's making a mess of things. What can I possibly do? So I think in general, there is definitely a willingness to not do those things, but which is kind of why I'm doing this. Like, how can we increase people's willingness to do those things? How can we motivate them to do those things? Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Chris, you have a question. Do you want to just ask Yolanda your question? I'm not sure I quite understand from the text you've written there.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. So Yolanda, great talk. Thanks, really good. And I think it's really important, this type of work. One of the things I come across with presentation that I've done to the public, that people at the end say, so why are you still so positive? And why you think the reef still has a chance? And of course, talking to a lot of dive instructors and dive crew, that's sometimes a challenging thing to explain why it's important. How would you say you would deal with that? How would you say social science can help with that?
Yeah, positive? I think that's so interesting, the whole like hope versus, you know, being just despair and sadness. And that's something which in the very first round of messaging that I didn't measure emotions, which I regret, and I wish that I measured them. Because in the second study where we found that, you know, it was feelings of sadness and grief that were motivating people, not hope. We also measured hope, but it didn't really do anything. But I think that's because in our messages, we really focused on collective efficacy and, you know, we can all do this. These actions are simple. Like we focused on that efficacy element, which a lot of climate communication work has said that despair works when you mix it with efficacy. And so I suspect that's why those negative feelings were useful in our study, because I'm the same as you. You know, people, I get asked like, how can you still keep doing this? It's so depressing. So I was convinced that hope would be a motivator. And we're still kind of looking into the role that optimism and hope for the reef and how that works. It might be that the broader Australian population has different emotional responses to people like us who work on the reef and who have been there every day. So definitely those kind of different emotions is an ongoing question. And there's not a lot of research on that at the moment. So it's really interesting. And yeah, if anyone's doing work on it, I'd love to hear about it.
Thanks for that.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Yolanda. Just, I'm not a behavioural scientist. I'm an anthropologist, but I've been working with some behavioural scientists recently, and their work is just fascinating. Chris, your question made me think of it. Their behavioural science theory around things like if you prime someone with the idea that you're giving them something in their question, they'll respond more positively, whereas if you prime them with the idea that you're taking something away, they will respond negatively. So all this kind of behavioural science thing, it's theories around how people respond differently depending on how you approach or prepare them for that message or for that thing in particular. I think is Yolanda.
Yeah, I don't want to say too much because I have a survey online right now and I don't want to give away the secrets. But no, there's a lot of different behavioral tools you can add. Surveys are really tricky. When I did my first one, I thought, okay, it'll take me like 2 days. I'll make a survey, I'll put it out there. But it took months because one of the problems with social science, kind of that conservation marketing work, like some of the early stuff that came out, people assumed a lot about how you collect this kind of data and how you do this behavioral work. There's a lot of assumptions that certain things lead to behavior without actually having those behavioral theories that come from psychology, you know, without incorporating that into how the surveys are designed and how the questions are made. So like behavioral theory, a lot of it, there's so much of it. A lot of it comes from public health research. I mean, you know, this year you've seen how hard it is to get people to do things, even with a threat like that's your health, like COVID is going to affect you physically. immediately. It's not like this abstract thing which everyone seems to think climate change is. But even getting people to do actions for that was hard. And so a lot of the same theories that have been used in public health, you know, getting people to stop smoking, getting people to wear sunscreen, it's not the same because climate change is obviously a lot more politicized and there's a lot more noise about in the climate space at the moment, but very similar. So we take a lot of those theories, you know, what leads to behavior, and we break them down and put them into experiments and surveys and interviews and try and pick them apart. So there's a lot of really interesting work out there on how you can nudge different behaviors, which feels a little bit sneaky when people are doing your surveys, but it's all ethics approved.
Which is a really good point you just raised, that I'm laughing. You're saying it's all ethics approved. We're not really manipulating people, but ethics is really rigorous in social science as well, just to put that out there to the biophysical science reef communities. So we always have to do quite rigorous ethics approval. We're not going out there experimenting on people in ways that might harm them. And during your talk, Yolanda, I was always thinking about one of the biggest things about being a social scientist is that if you write stuff about people, they will give you their opinion on what you have written about them. So, you know, there's this whole element of not only what you think you've understood, but then also what happens to that information once you put it out there. You know, that's the loop you want to create, is that it's an iterative process that's productive and useful for the people you are working with, your informants or participants, not just a sort of one-way download to some outcome that you want for something.
Yeah, well, it's like a lot of the surveys that we do a bunch of pilot surveys first, get a lot of feedback, see how, the best way they can be constructed. And like my favorite thing to do is read through comments at the end of surveys. Sometimes like the national surveys is a bit rough. Just when you think you're in your nice little climate bubble, you know, you get the rest of Australia and it can be a little bit confronting, but it's a really fun time to read through them.
Were there any other questions for Yolanda from attendees? Well, thank you, Yolanda. I think we've come to the end of the session. Sarah, do you want me to hand back over to you to close the meeting?
I think my mic's having a few problems, so I don't think we need to say anything more other than thanks very much, Yolanda, for educating us.
Thank you.